My name's Ray Almsteadt. I am the communications director here at Central and also part of the preaching team. And the last couple of weeks, we have been in a series called The Community Pull. We've been talking about how the community pull relates to a community of faith and what it means to be in a community of faith. And the Apostle Paul, one of the most prolific church planners of all time, had a lot to say about what it meant to gather as a community and how we should gather as a community. And we're just reviewing some of his words, some of the things that the letters that he wrote to the churches, and guiding and instructing them on how they should gather as a community of faith. And so in week one, Pastor Andy talked about why it's important for us to engage into the community. That we can read our Bibles on our own and we can pray on our own, but that is somehow different than coming together as the body of Christ and experiencing worship together and experiencing community together, and that we should try to get past our fears and our anxieties and dive into community and get involved in community. And then the second week, Pastor John challenged us to literally dive in, to get in the pool, and to not hold back. That sometimes there's some fear and trepidation about the water being cold or the water being too deep or can I swim, but that we just got to get past that. And our fears are sometimes warranted, but we just have to get past that in order to experience the greater reward of being together in a community. And then week three, Pastor Andy came back and he talked about the swim team and how we all bring a unique flavor to this community, that we're all different, we're all designed differently, and that God has made us that way so that together we can make something unique and beautiful in this community. And then last week, Pastor Laura, in her final sermon here at Central, she taught us about Adult Swim, and that the goal and the design of the community pull is for the next generation. And that's not just the next generation in our children, but the next generation in the community of faith, the new believers. And that as soon as we get a chance to participate, that we need to turn our eyes to the next so that they can experience the community as well. And so today, we're going to talk about guest pass, and we're going to talk about what Paul had to say to the church in Galatia and his guidance to them. And I could kind of take the normal route here of sort of like, maybe talking about how we need to reach out and engage the community and how we need to invite people to the community pool per se. But I really want to just talk about Paul's words and what he says in terms of how we should function as a community, sort of the essence of the community. Like, nobody invites somebody to a pool that doesn't have water in it, right? Nobody invites somebody to a pool that's full of algae, right? Nobody invites somebody to a pool that's dilapidated and falling apart. But in this instance, Paul is addressing the church and helping us to understand what the core values are of how we exist. Now, we all have experienced community pools in one way or another, right? But maybe you're a part of an apartment complex and there's a pool there. Maybe you're a member of a pool. Maybe you just find the local swimming hole to go to and experience it that way. For me, as a kid, our community pool was the largest trash can that we could fill. So we would fill the trash can and take turns just jumping in. The rich kids down the street, though, this was their pool. They had the whole dumpster. They were really blessed. So maybe that's your pool, or maybe this is your pool. Oh, is that Larry? It's Larry. Larry, that's a lot of soda. I don't think you're going to be able to drink that much soda. Whatever your community pool looks like, usually there's a guest pass system. There's some way of inviting people to experience the pool. But the whole essence of that invitation is how exciting and how wonderful the pool experience is. And so in order to sort of understand the bedrock of what this community should look like, in order to understand the very design and the intention of what it was supposed to, how it was supposed to exist, it's important that we go back to the words of Jesus, because Paul is just sort of like trimming the hedges and making sure that the church is staying in line with what Jesus has already established. But Jesus says it very clearly in John, I think it says it 11 on the screen, but it's actually 13, 34 through 35. A new commandment I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another. And this really is the gospel message, right? That Jesus loves us in all of our mess and our brokenness, and then we love others. And that continues to happen all over again. And even though I'm hard to love, and you're hard to love, and we're hard to love, he loves us anyway. And therefore, those who are hard to love in our life, we must love anyway. And so Paul has a lot to say in terms of how that this should function. He writes a letter to the Galatian church, who is basically this brand new church plant. And it's full of new believers, but there's enough experienced Christians there to cause a little confusion. And so he's writing a letter to them, and he's saying, no, it's about Jesus. It's about Jesus. We got to get our heart back on Jesus, and we got to put him at the center. And he's sort of guiding them. But before we dive into chapter 6, at the very end of chapter 5, which Paul goes into chapter 5 about, it's literally one of my favorite chapters of all the epistles. He talks about the freedom of Christ, and that how our works are nothing, and that what Jesus did is most important. And at the very end, the very last verse in 5:26 feels like it should be a part of chapter 6. So I'm going to read it in conjunction because it really sets up chapter 6 well. Galatians 5:26 says, "Let us not become conceited, provoking and envying each other." Brothers and sisters, as we go on to Galatians 6:1, brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. But watch yourself, or you may also be tempted. Now, there's a couple of things that Paul is saying here that's really important for us to note. Number one, Paul is talking about someone who is a hot mess, right? He's not talking about someone, when he's talking about burdens and he's talking about heavy weights later on into this verse, he's actually talking about transgressions. He's talking about trespasses. He's talking about sin. He's talking about someone who just cannot get away from sin, just keeps stumbling over and over and over and over again. And Paul is saying, hey, when you see this happening at the community pool, you can't look away. You can't just look away. Like, you've got to get involved, and you have to help restore this person. You have to be a part of restoring this person. And this is really important because the rest of this chapter, he sort of helps set the tone for what that looks like. He says, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. Now, when he talks about living by the Spirit, it is absolutely impossible for us to live by the Spirit and not live in the knowledge and the gratitude of how broken we are and how much Jesus has redeemed our life. We can't live in the Spirit, we can't function in the Spirit without looking to Jesus and knowing what he did for us, and without being aware of our own brokenness. And then he sets up in the very next sentence, he says, watch yourself, or you may also be tempted. Now, why would he be telling us who, they're messed up, right? Not me. I'm going to help them because they're messed up and I'm not as messed up as they are. Why is Paul warning me to be careful and to not be tempted? He's warning us because he knows that we're in danger of being conceited. We're in danger of being proud. We're in danger of seeing someone else's mess and thinking that our mess is not as messy as their mess. And he's like, be aware, don't fall into that trap. It's sort of like, imagine that you go through the cafeteria line and you select what you want from the cafeteria. You say, I'll take a slice of pizza, and give me some fries, and yes, I'd like a drink. And then you get to the register, and when you're at the register, there's Jesus standing at the register, and he's like, hey, I got this. He's on me. He's covered. You can go. You're like, oh, wow, like, thanks, Jesus. I was expecting to have to pay this, but you took care of it. Thank you. And you sit down, and you're sort of like basking in the gratitude of what Jesus just did for you. And then somebody else comes along, and then on their tray, they've got pizza, and they got French fries, and they got a soda, but they also have ice cream, and they have a giant cookie. And you're like, hey, I didn't know there was cookies. You're like, where'd you find the cookies? And they look at you, and you're like, man, Jesus paid for my meal. I'm so thankful. There's a couple ways that you could respond to that scenario. One is you could look at him and go, oh, see, like, I didn't ask Jesus to pay for my ice cream. I didn't ask him to pay for my cookies either. Like, he helped me with the pizza and the soda and the fries, but that's really all I needed. This guy needed a lot more than I did. So that's one way you could respond. Another way you could respond is that you could wish you had got an ice cream. You could sort of envy the situation. But what Paul's calling us to in terms of our response is that we realize that we had to get paid for, and we're thankful that they were paid for too. That we're looking at the gratitude of Jesus and not how we were mistreated, but we're looking at Jesus and we're being like, isn't God good? Isn't Jesus wonderful? I'm so glad that you got a free lunch, because I did too. And Paul goes in and he sort of continues to talk about this on chapter 2. And he talks about our role and our responsibility, and he says, carry each other's burdens. Carry each other's burdens. And in this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ. Sometimes, when we see a mess, we just want to walk away from it, right? We just want to say, I don't know what to do with that. You know, you're in the cafeteria line and somebody spills a drink. You're like, oh, I'm going to go this way. I don't know what to do with the mess. Sometimes we just don't want any parts of it. Sometimes we want to get involved for the wrong reasons. We want to get wrapped up in the mess, and we want to get wrapped up in the drama because it helps us think about something other than our own mess. We want to feel like we're sort of better because of that. But Paul is actually calling us to get down and to not walk away and to not look away, but to get down and be in the mess. Because he goes on and he talks about, bearing and carrying each other's burdens. You can't bear someone's burdens without bearing their burdens. You can't be detached and not carry their burdens. You have to say, you take a corner, I'll take a corner, we'll do this together. But he's saying, get in the middle of it. Participate in the suffering. And then he goes on to verse 3. If anyone thinks that they are something when they are not, they are deceived. They deceive themselves. Now, when would we think that we're something and we're not? When would that happen? We're certainly not looking at Jesus and going, hey, look, I see my life, and Jesus, I see your life, and I really feel like something. That's not what's happening. No, we feel like something when we go look over at our neighbor and someone else, and we find someone who's a little bit more messed up than us, and we go, okay, now I feel better, right? When we're looking this way and not looking this way, we suddenly feel justified. Looking this way it's a lose-lose situation. There's no way you can look to your neighbor and look to other people and have a win. You're either going to feel inferior or you're going to feel like you're less than them. And both of those are losing game. I remember a mentor when I was a young kid. I actually went to my mentor, and he had done this several times, and I would sort of pick on somebody and be like, that person, I don't understand why they're this way. And he had the same response every time. He would say, for whom Christ died. And it was the best response, and I hated the response because it reminded me that I was trying to pull somebody else's mess and feel better about it. But it was a great way of shutting down the conversation. It's a great way to remember that every human being in their mess is for whom Christ died. And the messier it is, and the more chaotic and crazy it is, all the more reason why Jesus died. And Paul goes on in verse 4, each one should test their own actions. They can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else, for each one should carry their own load. So this is weird, because in the prior verse, he's like, help someone carry their stuff. And then he's saying, you carry your own load. We're looking for some way of looking at our life and realizing, are we good? We need some kind of metric, right? We can't look at our neighbor. We can't look at our boss. We can't look at our brother-in-law, sister-in-law, or our family. But we have to know how we're doing right. And he's saying, compare yourself to Jesus. Look to Jesus. Measure against Jesus. And try to hold your own weight. Try to carry your own burden. You know, if there is no God and there is no Jesus, it makes sense for me to look at somebody else and to compare myself. But ultimately, since there is a Jesus and there is a God, doesn't it make sense for us to look to him to measure our life? He goes on to verse 6 and is sort of like a little side note so that we don't forget to care for those in need. Nevertheless, the ones who receive instruction in the word should share all good things with their instructor. And then verse 7, he goes in and he talks about a principle. And the principle is neither good nor bad. It just is. It's sort of like it's like gravity, right? It's like what goes up must come down. You know, Newton didn't create gravity. He discovered it. He acknowledged it. And then once you understand gravity, right, you can leverage it to your benefit, but you can also leverage it so that you don't make any mistakes, right? So you could say, you know, that gravity business, I don't believe it. And you can jump out of the window and you're still going to hit the ground, right? That's just the way it's going to be. You could say you don't believe in it or not. It's just going to happen. And Paul, in this next verse, he just lays out this principle, and he's like, this is the way it is. This is the truth. You can believe it or not, but this is the way it is. He says, do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. Whoever sows to please their flesh, from the flesh will reap destruction. Whoever sows to please the Spirit, from his Spirit will reap eternal life. Now, this to me is like, when you take in the context of all these verses, Paul put this here very strategically because it's almost like we can rest, right? We can relax, right? We don't have to feel like we have to fix everyone, right? If somebody theoretically or metaphorically wants to jump out of the window of their life, you know, sometimes we feel the need to like call out, what goes up must come down. And then when they hit the ground, we're like, you know, what goes up must come down. And it's not real helpful. But what Paul is calling us to do is just let the principles of God be what they are. But when they hit the ground, be there. When they hit the ground, stoop down with them and be there with them. And let your life point them back to Jesus. When I read these verses, it makes me know that I can just rest. And that if I truly believe in who Jesus is, and I truly believe in who God is, I can just relax, right? I can allow his love to live in such a way in me that it will bleed over into others. Verse 9, he goes on, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Paul reminds us that it can be overwhelming to be in the mess with people. And sometimes it can be harder to care for someone than it is to suffer. It can be harder trying to care for somebody who's suffering than to be the one that's suffering sometimes. It can be hard to relate and to understand and to be patient. And Paul's saying, I know that's hard. Don't grow weary. This is also a great little check that maybe if you're growing weary, you're enabling or taking on too much, and that you need to allow them to take more of their own load. That everyone should carry their own load, going back to verse 6. And then we go on to verse 10, and it says, therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially those who belong to the family of believers. He says, do good to all people. And then I love this last line, especially to the family of God. Especially to the believers. Why? Why would he say that? Is he creating an exclusion? That's not really guest pass friendly, right? This is the very insider. Why is he saying, especially to the family of God? Why is he saying that? Because they're the hardest ones, right? Our family, they keep coming back, right? We're always there. We're always there, and we're always in relationship. It's not like you can take a rain check on family. It's like Paul is saying that if we can get it right here, that it's going to bleed over to there. It's easy to be kind to a stranger and they move on. But it's different to walk side by side in the muck of mess with people that are family, with people that you have to see on a regular basis. So in conclusion, when we truly love one another, when we as a church community, as a pool, become a place where people can be restored and where they can make mistakes, when we can withhold our judgment and stay aware of our own flaws, when we recognize every individual as someone for whom Christ died, when we become an environment that warmly embraces all who come through these doors, then we become a pool that is full of the living waters of Jesus Christ. It's full of the gospel of Jesus, and it becomes undeniable. It becomes a place where people can find healing, where people can find hope, where people can find love.